Good afternoon, folks. My name is Dean Gustafson with H.W. Lochner, the National TISNO ITS Practice Lead. Welcome to our session today, where we're going to talk about maximizing public and private investments using communications and broadband initiatives. I'm going to moderate today's session. We had originally planned to have this session as a part of the ITS World Congress, but we have moved it to this webinar given everything that occurred last year. I would like to thank the National Operations Center of Excellence and the AASHTO Committee on Transportation System Operations for co-sponsoring this webinar today with H.W. Lochner. 76 years ago, when our founder, Harry Lochner, began to develop plans for the transportation system in the United States, from Illinois to Tennessee to Georgia to Florida, I wonder if he would have envisioned bundles of glass fiber would have been part of the transportation system. Especially in 2020, these bundles of glass fiber allowed us to work from home safely, extended access to jobs in rural areas, and help us operate our surface transportation system. So in this webinar today, we hope that we want to share some of our past experiences, some of our current challenges, and explore the future of those bundles of glass fiber and how they're going to be part of our transportation system. Let me go ahead and introduce our panel, and I would like to thank them for taking time out of their busy schedule. Again, my name is Dean Gustafson with H.W. Lochner, formerly with Virginia DOT. Introduce Anna Reed. She's an officer with the Pew Research Center in charge of the Broadband Research Initiative. We will then hear from Lynn Yoakum, who's the Fiber Optics Manager with Utah DOT. Ken Ernest, the Assistant Division Administrator with Virginia DOT in the Operations Division. The Operations Division Director, John Hibbard, with Georgia DOT. And lastly, Rob Brock, a Senior System Engineer at H.W. Lochner. So today's webinar, we are going to break it up into three parts. First, you will hear presentations from each of the panelists. They're going to talk about their current communication systems and broadband initiatives, and you'll hear that from each member. We will then have a moderated panel discussion where I'll ask questions of each of the panelists, and we'll have a little bit of a round robin. And then there'll be an opportunity for you all to ask questions and for us to try to answer your questions through the webinar. There is a chat box. I would encourage you to, as you go through, feel free to post your questions. And all this information and all the slides will be available through the National Operations Center of Excellence website. So they will be available for your reference should you need it. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So really the big question, why fiber? Well, many of you that are on this call are probably well aware that fiber optic communications, which has been around for the last really 40 years, offers the highest bandwidth and lowest latency available. It very easily supports a lot of state DOT ITS infrastructure, including connected automated vehicle applications. It is a very reliable and secure network. It's been around for many years. Many DOTs have extensive use of fiber, especially on their interstate system. Fiber does offer you a little more control over managing your network than leased services because you are in control of that network. That does become an issue in today's cybersecurity world to still make sure that you have a safe and secure network even though more and more things are being connected together. It has a high capital cost, but over a function of time, it has a very low recurring cost compared to leased services. So I want to touch on a little bit from a federal perspective, not just fiber, but this issue of resource sharing. This has been around in the United States for quite a while. In the late 80s is really where DOTs were provided the opportunity, or states, to expand their sort of use of the right-of-way and begin to offer some sharing of the right-of-way and allow folks to make exchanges. You will see that that allowed them to accommodate broadband on the right-of-way, predominantly the limited access, and it also talked about making sure there was open competition. In the mid-90s, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 really forced vendors to allow competing vendors to have access to these facilities. And then also in that year, Federal Highway and the FCC got together and they really agreed on what does this resource sharing look like, and that resulted in 2002 AASHTO issuing some guidelines on resource sharing, design guidelines, as well as guidelines on how to sort of value the right-of-way. And I think you may hear some of this from at least one of our panelists today as we go forward. So again, there's been federal legislation around for a while. The next is President Obama's administration. They issued an executive order in 2012 that really tried to push the broadband component of this and really encourage and facilitate the use of broadband. So when it came to federal lands, buildings, rights-of-way, et cetera, do things that would encourage the deployment of broadband. You also see the emphasis on a dig once approach, so that rather than tearing up a city street or other highway multiple times, that you focus on trying to get that coordinated, which is a real challenge in a lot of our urban cities to make that happen. No matter where you are in the country, that seems to be a constant challenge, and that was an attempt to try to have some planning and coordination in advance. And the last sort of set of direction in this space has really been Federal Highway Administration last August published a notice of proposed rulemaking that would make some changes to help accommodate the Mobile Now Act that was passed in 2018 with really four main elements. And they are, first, that a state DOT has to identify a broadband utility coordinator and position within the state. It would then have to establish a registration process for broadband infrastructure providers or entities, get that process, and then also communicate with them what their state transportation improvement program looks like. Again, the idea that you want to be able to leverage investments both on the public sector and help the private sector understand where those investments are going to be in time. And then lastly, making sure there's some coordination of initiatives between mobile broadband, transportation plans, local transportation and land use planning, and really strategies around the repeated excavations of the right-of-way. So as of right now, I believe that Federal Highway has received comments and are going through those comments as we speak. So that's a little bit of background from a federal perspective on sort of resource sharing and how it applies to surface transportation. So let me turn it over to Anna, and she's going to go ahead and talk a little bit about sort of broadband and how states are expanding the use of broadband. Anna?
Thanks, Dean, and thanks so much for the invitation to join the webinar today. So I am Anna Reed. I'm a research officer with the Pew Charitable Trust Broadband Research Initiative. Pew is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, and the Broadband Research Initiative has specifically been focusing on the role of states in expanding broadband access, looking both at state policy activity and also at the programmatic activity at the state level that's driving investment in last mile broadband infrastructure expansion. So projects that serve homes, small businesses, and so forth. We have done a pretty thorough scan of state broadband policy. We have this tool on our website. We're currently in the process of updating it to reflect the last legislative sessions in states. But currently, it reflects things that were current as of January 1, 2020. And we've done some legislative analysis on legislative policy trends and how state policy shapes broadband deployment. With that, we've found that state policy primarily falls into 5 categories. These include, establishing those broadband programs and offices, setting goals for expansion and defining key terms such as broadband or what unserved or underserved areas are, creating funding and financing mechanisms to support those infrastructure deployment projects, addressing who can and can't provide service in that state, and then addressing, we kind of group this as infrastructure attachment, including things like pole attachments. So this is where you see states adopting dig once policies and fiber sharing policies and things of that nature. So that's kind of just a broad overview of how states have been addressing broadband through policy. There's also then the programmatic element, and a number of states, nearly all states now have some form of broadband program. This can take the form of a broadband office, or a sort of more diffuse program in one or multiple agencies, often Department of Economic Development, Department of Community Development, Office of Information Technology, or the Governor's Office. Many of these state programs also have a broadband task force or a broadband council, often focused on some level of interagency coordination, and we do see, increasingly states setting up something of this nature, which often includes, the Department of Transportation as one of the agencies engaged in those efforts. The core activities of these programs include engaging stakeholders around expanding broadband. Again, this can include that element of cross-agency collaboration, managing data related to where broadband is and is not available in the state, administering grant programs, and so this, of course, is funding directly to drive deployment of that broadband infrastructure in unserved communities, and then the planning component, and Dean touched on this with the rulemaking, some level of coordination so that people are aware of projects that are underway and that those can be coordinated. And then just quickly on some of the federal level funding that is driving and will be likely to drive broadband deployment efforts in states now and over the next year. A number of states committed a portion of their coronavirus relief funds, the aid to state and local government through the CARES Act, to support broadband deployment. Initially, that funding had to be extended by the end of 2020. That's now been extended, but it created a need to extend that funding quickly to get those projects underway very quickly. States that have committed funding to this include Virginia, which invested over $30 million of their coronavirus relief funds in broadband expansion, Tennessee, which put $61 million towards that, as well as several others. And then in the recent appropriations bill, there was also significant funding for broadband, including $1 billion specifically for broadband on tribal lands, and additional funding for rural and unserved areas. And those funds will have to be expended within 1 year of being directed towards those projects. So those are just some of the ways that states are currently invested in advancing broadband, and some of the federal funding opportunities that are likely to be driving some of those last mile projects over the next year or so. With that, I will turn it over to Lynn.
Well, thank you. So you're going to hear next from Lynn Yoakum, and one of the things you'll hear about Utah is their extensive fiber resource sharing program, and especially when it comes to sharing with other public sector agencies. So, Lynn?
Thank you. Can you hear me, Dean? Can you hear me, Dean? Okay, good.
Yes.
A little mic trouble there for a little bit. I wanted to go through what UDOT has done with the extent of our fiber optic network. We've been doing deployment of fiber optics now for well over 20 years within our state. If you take a look here, this is kind of the extent of our fiber optic network as of May this year. We've even had more expansion since then. We have this percentage of our interstates covered, which I'm really proud of. That's actually under construction currently, or going to be built within this year. Okay. The slides don't seem to be advancing, Dean. I'm hitting the slides, they're advancing on my side. Did that go to the next slide, guys?
Yes.
So, okay, let's go.
Where you want to be.
This was our extent of our network right here. And this is the interstates. This is how many interstates we're going to have, percentage of our interstates covered by the end of this year, 2021. This is our trade chart This kind of keeps track of how many conduit miles it went in. All right, I'm playing catch the slide with someone. Okay, this is our slide chart. Dean, I'm going to let you I'm just going to say next slide, Dean, for you, and then just have you change for me. Is that all right? Okay.
Yep.
This shows here on this chart our fiber optic network over the past 19 years. What UDOT's put in is in the yellow. In the orange is what our partners have put in. The line graph is the valuation that we've put that we feel that that UDOT has gained. That's not our partners' gain. That is what UDOT has gained. Next slide. This is a summary of our fiber optic public-private partners. With each of our regions, we have projects that are going with each one. There are several that I wanted to highlight that are my favorite, and that's what I'm going to do with the rest of the presentation, is show you some of the exciting projects that we have going with our partners. Next slide. Daggett. We just finished and opened up 67 miles of fiber optics, and you can see this beautiful area that it's installed through. Next slide. This is a beautiful recreational area. This is the Flaming Gorge Dam. I don't know if any of you have been out to that area, but it has great fishing, great vista views, but it is very, very rural, very rural. Next slide. We put in this fiber optic network. You can see right there the side. These are our fiber optic marking signs with our box, and you can see that this is very rural, and that this was within 3 months of after we had finished plowing in. You can see very minimal environmental impact. We're tucked up right by the road. Next slide. We had a lot of challenges with rock and weather. With that, you can see that it's just pulling up just shell, and then trying to get your conduit to lay in and not puncture is a little tough. Next slide. The major benefits to healthcare and education are immense with these type of projects. That is how we actually got some of the funding. We partnered with our Utah Education Telehealth Networks, and it was part of E-rate funds to help get this together. UDOT put in $500,000, UETM put in $500,000. We had $2 million that came from federal E-rate funds, and then Strata Networks, who we partnered with, put in almost another $1.5 million. Next slide. It has really helped enhance this community. They did a great big ribbon cutting ceremony for us to be able to show us how fast now they can transfer x-rays from their medical clinics, where they were doing it by microwave before, and it could take a really long time, and how fast the schools were connecting. And they were very excited. They really rolled out the red carpet to say thank you. Next slide. Next slide. Our Cottonwood Canyons is a really good example of being able to bring safety to canyons. Next slide. Next. Oh, there it is. We had a lot of stakeholders. Hit your space bar. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. This was the stakeholders just to put that project together. So when you're thinking of fiber optic projects, really remember how many stakeholders you're going to have. Next slide. And look at what you plan to do with your fiber optics once you put it in. We've got lots of plans for it. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Here is a project summary of the Cottonwood Canyons. It was an estimated $5 million project. We had 35 poles. We also ran electricity for the ITS system at the same time so that we could connect, because that camera was really hard. That canyon was really hard for electricity. We have we also are doing now CARES Act projects. Like what was mentioned, UDOT got $34 million on that. This is our A84 installing. We're putting in 8 conduits along this section. Next slide. Next slide. We are putting everything out to underserved areas. And in fact, today, right after this meeting, we have to go for a photo op up in that exact area. So this was another one, was our I-70. This was 23 million, and we made it 117 miles with that. We are just finishing up. We are extremely grateful for the extra time. We were right down to the wire, and it's only going to take us an extra 30 days to finish that project, not another year. Next slide. Along this project, we're also putting in what are called public Wi-Fi hotspots that we're transporting back across our network because there is no cell coverage in this area. We've been putting in using innovative equipment to install this, and we'll be actually backhauling on the state's network public Wi-Fi access points in 7 locations. Next slide. Next slide. Big challenge to get across here, and under and through culverts. Next slide. This is how many partners that we had within this project and stakeholders. Next slide. This is how many other partners that we trade with. These are our city and county and local governments. Next slide. These are all of our telecoms. Next slide. Our state agencies. Next slide. I always get asked how many people does it take to run our department. Here is a nice organizational chart. How many people are directly involved with our groups. Next slide. I also included for your reference a telecom partnering flow chart. This is how we go through and assess what's our process to be able to do a trade. Our pull box spacing typically is we're now going less than 2,000 feet because of connected vehicle. We were at 2,000, maybe a little plus from 2,000, but we found that for connected vehicles, we're going less than 2,000. Next slide. Here are a bunch of links that you might find interesting and fun. Our Utah code, our fiber map, some videos that show our latest projects that's there. And that is taking us to our last slide. Let's see. Within interstate right-of-way or releasing RFPs for fiber owners, we are installing it within our right-of-ways. I like to own a lot that's in there. They can come in and install if they would like to, but it's easier for me to move and control if we own it. And it's open access to any interested parties. We do not do exclusive on our right-of-ways. And they can come back and put it in our right-of-ways too if they want to, even after we've put it in. So we are not exclusive on that. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Lynn. Again, you can hear an extensive program. You don't have those many trade partners doing that overnight. This has been a long journey for Utah for over several decades. So tremendous program. Now let's turn it over to Ken Ernest, Assistant Division Administrator for Operations for Virginia DOT. And one of the things we hear, VDOT also has done a lot of resource sharing, but you're going to hear some interesting nuances that they've moved beyond just exchanging of fiber and moved in some other ways of doing transactions with cash and other capabilities. So with that, Ken?
Great. Thank you, Dean. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All righty. So the first thing I want to touch on, and Dean kind of touched on the value of this earlier in the presentation, to VDOT, what we've discovered is this really presents an enormous cost avoidance. So when you look at the cost of installing fiber, anywhere up to $300,000 per mile, depending on how sophisticated your network is, and then even some of the ongoing O&M expenses, that's a very considerable investment that DOT would have to otherwise make. So as an example, if you just look at the 1,600 miles that we've lit up from the resource sharing routes that we have, that represents almost a $500 million asset that's at our disposal. So, there's tremendous value there. We always like to use the example of getting cameras off of leased circuits because they are bandwidth hogs, and that can save us up to $5,000 per year. So again, a lot of financial incentive for entering into resource sharing agreements. Next slide. So as a matter of history, we're really blessed within Virginia based on the administrative code and the flexibility that it grants us. So for any entities that want to enter our limited access rights of way, VDOT is able to receive any combination of goods and services in cash. Now historically, we have focused on just receiving raw fiber strands, but that has changed more recently in the last couple of years, and I'll touch more on that. So our program's a little over 20 years old, and we have been the benefactor of a couple of major initiatives. There was a major tobacco settlement back in the early 2000s. Then under the Obama administration, we had some broadband stimulus money that came in. The growth of the internet has been a continual thing, especially in Northern Virginia. And from that, we've seen a number of data centers pop up throughout the state. And then most recently, we've had some transoceanic cable landings in the Virginia Beach area. So all of those have been major drivers that have led to the success of our program. So to date, we have 23 unique agreements, 23 different partners, and they really run the gamut, everything from major telcos like Verizon to wholesale providers like Summit IG here in Virginia that really focus on raw fiber and conduit to other third parties. Then we have regional co-ops, and we also have a number of public agencies, so cities, counties, and even school boards. And similar to what Lynn had mentioned, all of our agreements are non-exclusive. Next slide. So this just shows you kind of the growth of our total mileage of resource sharing throughout the state. You can kind of see the three bumps there. 2004 was around the tobacco settlement that landed us a fairly major agreement. 2012 timeframe, we saw some of the broadband stimulus funding, and then more recently was some of the cable landings in the Virginia Beach area. That's what's really kind of driven things the last couple of years. So we're right at 5,000 miles most recently, and we're always looking to light up more and more of those miles. So next slide. And this is the map that shows where all of the fiber routes are in Virginia. The predominance of these are the resource sharing routes at over 5,000 miles. We do have about 320 miles of agency-owned fiber. Most of that is split between the Northern Virginia area and Hampton Roads area. It might be a little hard to see, but there's some, there are 5 stars on the map there that show where our TOCs are located. Each one of our TOCs is connected to fiber. The bigger thing that we've been doing here in the last couple of years is really starting to build our statewide backbone so that there's interconnectivity between the TOCs. Next slide. So, you know, traditionally, like with a lot of states, what we've done with our fiber through resource sharing is get our ITS devices off of lease services and onto that fiber. But as our network has grown, it's also kind of opened the door for some other broader initiatives. And one of those in particular is getting our TOCs directly connected into these major data centers. This is an ongoing initiative that we have right now that we hope to tackle through this current calendar year. And the idea is for our TOCs to have robust, redundant connections into multiple data centers, and then have all of our systems, like our ATMS system, transferred into the cloud. Again, you know, ensuring reliability for the network and for our systems. That in turn allows us to reduce these major pipes that we have from each of our TOCs into these data centers. And likewise, we'll continue to get our roadside devices off of lease services and onto the fiber. And as we expand into some of the rural locations, we'll even get some of our signalized intersections on fiber as well. Next slide. You may have to hit it again. And so in wrapping up, I do want to focus on some of the items that Dean mentioned as far as where we've kind of driven our program over the last couple of years. For the longest time, we had a somewhat informal methodology for determining what we get out of a given agreement as far as number of fiber strands and so forth. We really decided to take a more systematic approach in determining the value of each agreement. And so to do that, we really had to look at, what is the value of a given limited access right-of-way segment that someone's requesting. And so it's a pretty straightforward process, but we use what we call across the fence or over the fence methodology, where we look at prevailing land values, recently sold plots adjacent to those parcels that are being requested, and on a county-by-county basis come up with a number, a square foot cost, basically, for that fiber installation. It's not necessarily a perfect methodology, but I would say it gets us in the ballpark. And by going through that exercise, we feel like it's allowed us a better standing so that when we do ask for some number of fibers or a particular value in cash value, that we've got something relatively solid to stand on. And so far over the last couple of years, that's really held up well for us. So the other thing that we've done is we've also included broader terms as far as use of the fiber. Historically, we've really just limited our fiber use, even in the agreement, to just the operational or ITS aspects. But now we've included broader terms that include the availability for public safety, education, basically any public body. And so the last thing I want to mention is a comprehensive fiber asset management tool that we're deploying. We're looking to use a tool called OSP Insight. And the important piece around that is really getting consistent and having a statewide view into where all of our fiber assets are. Like many folks, we've kind of managed that on a regional basis through spreadsheets and databases. This will really give us a statewide view in one place that will allow us to support all of those life cycle functions, everything from planning to day-to-day operations, utility locates, and so forth. So with that, I'm looking at one of the questions here about does VDOT permit access of your fiber asset management tool to other TISMO areas such as construction and public vendors. This is a relatively new initiative for us. I would say over on the ITS asset side, we do have a program in place that's been in use for a number of years now, and we feel that we've got a really strong process as far as managing assets over there. I think the idea is that we would mature our fiber management to that same point. And then to the extent that it makes sense, because there is some sensitivity with the data, we would certainly open that up to others as necessary. That's everything I've got, Dean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Again, so you can hear a little bit different approach between what Utah has done and Virginia has done. And now we're going to transition over to Georgia DOT, and John's going to talk about, they've taken this even a step further, and they're going to talk quite a bit about the public-private partnerships, or P3 approach, that Georgia DOT has taken in their broadband program. John?
Thanks, Dean. Just to confirm that everybody can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much. It's glad to have an opportunity here to talk. You can go ahead and advance that slide. That's fine. Our position, Georgia's position, is so different than Virginia's and Utah's. Both of theirs are a testimony to what they've been doing. They've been doing it for a while. We are not in such a position. I only have like 4 slides in this thing, so you're not going to get bored off slides on this one, although Lynn did an amazing job with her slides. This graphic here, which is kind of a zooming in to the metro Atlanta area, shows the overwhelming majority of our existing fiber optic infrastructure. All agency owned. The red that you see there is underground, under the outside shoulder, typically, of interstates and some other limited access facilities. The green is along surface routes, so well, state routes, arterials, and is mainly for traffic signal interconnection, of course, video as well, and the overwhelming majority of that green is aerial. The red is roughly 300, a little bit over 300 centerline miles worth of fiber. If you would go to the next slide. The challenge is when you zoom out to the state, you can see there's a lot of the state that really doesn't have much fiber. You see a few bits, they are kind of in the middle of the state, and that's Macon. And you see a couple of bits in the Metro Columbus area, but you get the idea. All of our fiber network is overwhelmingly in Metro Atlanta. So that takes us to why we're so interested in some sort of a broad fiber expansion. Our ITS system in Georgia we call Navigator, and so we would like to be able to expand the Navigator system statewide. We do have devices, cameras, signs, scattered across the state, but as you can see from this, overwhelmingly our communication to them is wireless, or maybe I would say cell-based, which has an ongoing monthly bill associated with that. We've heard that mentioned already in slides. It also has its own hassles, own problems, when you have times of overloaded networks, because anybody's fiber network is only sized for a certain amount of traffic. And when we have had those overloaded networks is when there has been, say, a hurricane or hurricanes coming, likely hitting Florida. Florida is, of course, just below the bottom of this map. If Florida evacuates, they evacuate into or through Georgia. And it is safe to say that every car has at least one or maybe several cell phones that are on, alive, and cooking as they try to evacuate. That limits our ability to use our devices. So we not only want fiber everywhere from a good practice context and from a reduced monthly expenditure context, but also from a network reliability context. But note also, if we do this along interstates, and our focus is along interstates, is it would establish a backbone to help with that rural broadband issue that we hear so much about these days. As well, we're wanting to encourage 4G, really, it's 5G wireless deployment across the state, because every time you see one of those new and small cell sites, well, there's fiber to it, and will always be the case. We would ideally, of course, love to do this in a revenue neutral or a minimized revenue investment context. Go ahead and switch to the next slide. And so this is what we have developed for our statewide broadband or wireless P3. And just to be straight with you, we are getting ready for our second swing at this thing. The first one, our first P3 to accomplish this, ultimately ended up being canceled. And there are lessons all over the place to be learned in that. And we walked away with those lessons in hand and have spent the subsequent couple of years working to come up with remedies, responses, corrections to those lessons learned. And so we are about to the point where, oddly, in some part thanks to the pandemic, we stand to get started again with another crack at the statewide P3. And heavily brought on by the fact that we had the opposite of people evacuating Florida. Back in March, April, we had people trying to get to Florida along I-95, which you see there in red, along the coast. And they were stopped at the Florida state line, well, by the state of Florida, who were checking vehicles. And the queue extended mightily back into Georgia. Consequently, we got funding to put in fiber along all of I-95 in Georgia, which is about 110 miles. And so that darn near gave us what we needed to restart our fiber P3 project. And so we hope to get that going quickly here because, frankly, there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of enthusiasm. And frankly, that enthusiasm is only apt to increase here, even as we march into this new administration. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to be part of the panel discussion in a bit. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, John. Again, you can see taking a very different approach, which, again, there is no one way to go through fiber resource sharing. There's many different approaches. So let me turn it over next to Rob Brock. Rob is our Senior System Engineer at H.W. Lochner, and before joining Lochner, he's spent quite a bit of time working for several of the fiber carriers and has done a lot of work in network management, and so he brings a perspective been on the private side of this equation. And so Rob's going to share some of his perspective around broadband and sort of where the future is and what some of the other considerations that we need to think about as we go forward in time. So, Rob?
Can you hear me, Dean?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you go to the first slide? Next slide, Dean. That's the nationwide. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm trying to give you a perspective. We've heard from three of our colleagues, Lynn, Ken, and John, regarding their efforts and their initiatives in their states in the deployment of broadband across their state for multiple aspects and reasons. I wanted to bring a perspective to the participants is that when you engage the other side, the carrier side, the Facebooks, the Verizons, the AT&Ts, what they're looking at from their end for them to make a decision to move forward, you obviously have requirements and you have burdens of building the network on a limited budget. The carriers, conversely, have the same requirements. If they can build on your roadway and it's less expensive than going on a state road and using the permits, they're obviously, from their business model, whatever makes sense for them, they're going to pursue. And this map that you see that's a nationwide map, obviously the granularity is not as high, but the gray lines represent interstates and interstate right-of-ways, and the yellow line would represent a representative carrier's deployment. And a lot of times you'll see that the yellow lines are outside of the gray lines because they used railroad right-of-way, they used utility power companies where they have the 100-mile transmission lines, they use that right-of-way. They'll use state road because the Communications Act allows you to go on state roads for a nominal permit fee, and that allows their business models to be able to build out these systems. When it comes to combining and you coordinate with them, they're going to look at your business model and your aspects. If you have rules and regulations that facilitate them to build in your right-of-way and it makes sense for them from a business perspective and their financial model, they're going to pursue that, bar none. And we've seen some big success in other states, Utah and Virginia, and multiple other states have multiple aspects. This is kind of the reason I'm trying to give you a carrier-based perspective on what they're looking at. Fiber, number one, is the alternative. From a state perspective, I can tell you, from a network perspective, it's by far the most secure. It's in the ground. It's on your right-of-way. It's protected. And if you look at the security aspects of the ransomwares and the attacks that are going on from a cyber perspective, it's the most secure when you can have your own network that you control. If you use other aspects like wireless or satellite or leased circuits, you're relying on other providers to provide you some level of security along that path. And the next slide, can you go to the next slide, Dean, please? And I'm going to go through wireless, I'm going to go through satellite, then we'll drop back quickly to fiber. From 5G carrier deployments, my colleague John is building out his network in Georgia, and they're using wireless as a means. I have experience in wireless, and I contacted Qualcomm. Every single cell phone that we use, everybody uses, has a Qualcomm chip in it. And I spoke to the engineers there, and basically they see the 5G deployments coming out, but they do have issues with 5G. Number one is the signal strength that they're allowed to transmit and the frequencies they're allowed to transmit. They gate about a 2,500-foot transmission path from their from their towers. That's the reason that you see a lot of the small cell deployments around the tower, that they aggregate all the users into these small cells and they transmit via fiber up to the tower and back to their connection offices. The cost for rollouts are high. You're seeing that Verizon and AT&T and others are doing these expensive rollouts. I'm not saying that 5G is not bad. They're putting in the infrastructure for the next generations, 5G and the next generations. The access, the limitations in rural access. You have the urban access where they're putting most of the small cells because that's where the population centers are. The rural access is the areas that are any part of your rural parts of your states. You know, the interstate goes within 20 miles of most 80% of the population. There's a limitation of building out the networks to there. The current versions of the 5G chipsets have a battery drain on devices, both the user devices and obviously the carrier routers at their towers and their small cell sites. Along with all these small cell sites, the cities are grappling with the aesthetics of it. They're putting small cell sites on almost every corner in these cities to build out their networks, and the cities are working with these agencies to hide or, you know, basically mask the look of an antenna or an access point. The range of connectivity is not as great because of the short, the frequency wavelengths are short, so that affects the range. In addition, they're running 6G in labs right now to address some of these issues. And what I don't have on here, FCC is also reallocating spectrum space, frequency allocation space, and they're in the process of trying to free up space in a lower frequency that allows for a longer transmission rates. Could you go to the next slide, Dean, please? Let's get to satellite broadband. This is something that's that one thing I wanted to mention. A lot of the states, or some of the states that I've worked with, one of the burdens that they shared is providing broadband to others than the DOT and what your purview is. Some governors and states have broadband initiatives to get it to the rural areas of the U.S., what I'm saying, the last mile of fiber. And from a carrier perspective, the last mile of fiber has been the unreachable goal. And from why that is that their financial models don't permit. If you want to build $100 million of fiber around Atlanta or around Salt Lake City, you can reach 75 or more of the population. If you want to build it in lower part of Utah or the lower part of Georgia, you're going to spend the same amount of money but reach maybe 10% of the population. So the financial models never really aligned with the rural broadband initiative. What's come up recently and what you've probably seen in the news, Starlink from SpaceX, they've launched over 600 satellites. They got, I think, another 1,200 to go up. So they can give continuous coverage of all of the U.S., obviously all of the Earth. Two-thirds of the Earth is water. So, but I mean, over the land base, they can cover 100% of the rural areas. And what I see as a benefit for DOT agencies is that you don't have to spend your assets and your money trying to meet this may work out, a government role or a goal. If you put in fiber on your network, you have to spend some money to get it to the rural areas, or this could be a boon. This FCC and the government has seen this. In the last year, they allocated $16 billion of federal funds to do the rural broadband contracts. They've awarded $10 billion, $6 billion to SpaceX Starlink, $3 billion to Comcast from a fiber perspective, and another $1 billion to a private firm that's doing other initiatives with wireless, et cetera. I see, and they have I think another $6 billion that's going to be awarded in 2021. So that's a lot of money that's going to allow the broadband aspect of getting to the rural schools and to the rural agencies in the areas where the less dense populations don't have access. They'll be able to have an antenna and a router and be on the internet, and that would greatly benefit the government agencies that are trying and are tasked with getting broadband to the remote areas. That goes back to the fiber. If you have the three things that I talked about was fiber optic infrastructure, which is by far the best, safest, and most secure. There is a cost benefit from a carrier perspective. The right-of-way that you control has value to them, but it must meet their financial models. And if you can incorporate that along with, the 5G and the 6G, future 6G coming out, and maybe with the satellite broadband, those would lessen the requirements of other agencies on your agency to allow you to move forward. That's it. Thank you very much. I think I'm done,
Great.
Dean.
Thank you very much, Rob. So again, I think it's important to hear not just the public sector perspective, but I think it's also very important to hear about the private sector perspective, because that is key as we move forward. So we're now going to transition to a moderated panel discussion among all of our panelists. Please keep your questions coming. We're doing our best to try to answer them. We will be keeping these questions and answers so that we can folks can have this afterward for their reference. So let me first start off with the first question. Let me address this to Lynn. Lynn, what impact will the Federal Highway Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on the Mobile Now Act on broadband that I spoke of earlier, what do you think that will have? What impact will that have on your state?
I don't think it's going to have a lot of impact on our state, because we kind of already do almost everything that they're having us, that they're asking for. So we're kind of ready and kind of already doing it. So we're not seeing a huge impact.
Okay.
I don't know if that's
okay. Anyone else? Ken, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think, from that dig once kind of aspect, that's where it'll probably help us. It'll give us a little more something to kind of stand by, in our more congested areas in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, where we do have some of those congested utility corridors.
Okay. John, any thoughts?
It's interesting because, as anybody on the webinar has seen, our situation is very different than Virginia's or Utah's, but yet we look at it and we commented on the NPRM, but really we didn't see a boatload of impact. We looked at it heavily from a coordination with the private sector perspective, and we kind of pride ourselves on that already happening through our utility coordination office. So we didn't come away saying this is going to turn us upside down.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. Let me move on to another question. Let me ask Ken to start with this. Ken, what impact will opening the 5.9 megahertz spectrum have on fiber optic communications?
Yeah, so if I understand, what's being opened up there, that bottom 45 megahertz off of the 5.9 gigahertz is being targeted for, expanded Wi-Fi capabilities. So I think, if we're going to see more bandwidth being made available at endpoints through the opening up of the spectrum, I can only think that that's going to drive the need for additional fiber backbone as backhaul for that new bandwidth that ultimately comes along. I think it'll be an incremental thing. I don't think it's going to be, overnight, but I think ultimately it will lead to a greater need for fiber optics for backhaul.
Okay. John, any comments on any different perspective?
Ken did a nice job of jumping over all of the stuff that I want to wallow in instead, because I think he's right. The challenge is that the FCC had also repurposed a nice chunk of spectrum earlier last year for Wi-Fi. And so you've got that chunk which is yet to be really put into use. And then you've got the, we call it the lower 45, that's what Ken called it, of the 5.9, which really will not be fully ready, available, usable, let's go buy stuff that uses it-able for 3 years. So it's going to be incremental because, well, it's going to take 3 years to get there. And then devices have to be made that use it. Whatever you've already bought, whatever I already have in this house that is Wi-Fi, it's built to use a certain bit of the Wi-Fi spectrum. And for instance, it's not built to use either of those two chunks that I just talked about. So gradual consumption, I guess. And so gradual increase for backhaul needs.
Okay. Rob, anything from a systems or network perspective?
No, I concur. John said it succinctly. Once you purchase your equipment at a certain frequency, it's not like a TV. You can't change the channel to the lower frequency automatically. What you bought is a frequency that's hard-coded into the chipset. So if you want to go allocate this new frequency and they keep opening it up, you have to have another investment. That's it.
Indeed.
Okay. Yeah,
We're
Liz.
still in mourning that we lost that on the 5.9. So
Go ahead, Jay.
we're still in mourning that we
Amen.
lost that. So
Understood. You know, I think we're all going to have to see how that plays out, and you know, the impact of that decision by the FCC in the last administration. You know, and to what impact that will remain in the next administration or might change. I think we're all just going to have to wait and see. But unless anyone has anything else, we'll move on to the next question. John, for you, what impact will connected and automated vehicles or Internet of Things have on the use of fiber optic communications?
Well, I think I'll take the first part first, right? And that's the connected and autonomous vehicles. There will be an increased need for, well, it's the backhaul bit again, in conjunction with connected vehicles. And I think we're all trying to get our brains around how much that is or how much that will be. The good thing is that fiber optic cables, as we've learned, gosh, over the 30 plus years that it's been deployed, is it can increase it, or its capacity can be increased as the switchgear on each end of the fiber becomes more capable of doing so. So we're in a good position in terms of our ability to respond to that increased need that would be connected vehicle created. Really, the Internet of Things aspect of it, I'm going to contend that Ken and I kind of touched on that previously. It's coming. It's gradual. But notice a lot of that Internet of Things is that communication occurring between the device and some distant server, or is that communication practically, well, like within my house here, where maybe the TV is Wi-Fi enabled and other things are, and really the Wi-Fi need is not so much a backhaul need, it's really just a way for gadgets to communicate within a certain space. And so we'll see how that plays out over time.
Okay. Anna, any perspective from the research that you all have done on the impact of CAV and Internet of Things on broadband?
I would just add that, you know, we see the focus and investment on in CAV and Internet of Things and opening up some of these opportunities to expand broadband, because there obviously needs to ensure the infrastructure is there to support those in areas that are you know, also unserved and underserved. And so it is providing that opportunity to form those partnerships and extend you know, fiber that can then facilitate some of those last mile deployment efforts into areas where it isn't currently.
Lynn, do you want to go ahead and follow on that? Because, you know, many folks are well aware that Utah has had a very aggressive connected automated vehicle program, and, you know, how your fiber network and communications supports that. So you want to sort of touch on that component of the question? Anything else you'd like to
our
add?
connected vehicle, we are in a project with Panasonic right now. And our fiber optics gives us all the backbone connectivity that we need out to all the devices. That was a question that was asked earlier about our box spacing. Are you going 2,000 feet or less because of the sensors? And it's exactly that reason. So we used to have a standard about 2,500, and we've had to shift it down to more boxes per mile so that we can have those sensors in those optimal locations to be able to talk to each other from sensor to sensor and back. And we found that if we have the fiber optics, we're getting really good feed times back off those sensors that we need, as opposed to maybe wireless that's there. I think a combination between both of them, between your wireless and your fiber optics, is exactly what every transportation section needs, to be able to do those connected vehicles. So if you've got the backbones and you put them in, make sure, number one, you do enough access points. That's your box locations. Don't put it in and not. And when you partner, a lot of times your partners will tell you that we can't access the fiber optics. So negotiate for dark strands of fibers that you can take tells off and put your boxes anywhere you need on that backbone if you're sharing a backbone infrastructure with it. But fiber is very important for the connected vehicle and to make sure that you've got those access points to be able to talk back.
Rob, let me ask you just a quick sort of a follow-up from that. From a network perspective, what impacts are CAV and Internet going to have from a networking perspective?
There is, depending upon how much data the vehicles are transmitting and how much data is going from the data centers and servers to the vehicles, the information back and forth, once you build up a system of users, it's going to be significant, up in the multiple gigabits per second. The cars today can transmit up to 8 gigabits of data per hour, depending upon all the sensors. What's transmitted from there is still to be determined based on the connected vehicle and the vehicle to infrastructure and infrastructure to vehicle means. That's going to dictate how much data is going to be required. Gigabit at a minimum to begin with, and then it'll be a monitoring on a case by case, and that as the program grows basis.
You're also looking at what data do you want to keep that car is transmitting. When we started, you get so much data that comes, and you have to really filter on what is really important that you want to keep, because you can get a lot of data.
You're right. The challenge for, I think, all agencies to focus on how you turn that data into usable and actionable information.
Yes.
Let me go ahead and let me just take one question that came in from Ron. From a utility corridor perspective, has anyone explored longitudinal installations of electric grid infrastructure along their fiber?
So we kind of did a little bit of that with our Cottonwood Canyons. We put electrical system for the DAS systems and for all of our ITS systems that went up the canyons, and we put it right beside our fiber optics. One of your biggest challenges is not getting the fiber optics in the ground, it's to be able to get electricity to your fiber optics. So I really found Ron's question really quite exciting. I'm going, absolutely, we should be putting electrical grid corridor next to the fiber so that we can actually have more devices and be able to do it at not as high expense. The highest expense for just deploying ITS devices is that electrical component, is trying to get hooked up to electricity and bring it in, or doing a big solar farm, what we call for it, to be able to hook in. So we've done a little bit of it, but I'm interested to hear if somebody else has thought about allowing the electrical grid in.
Any other comments or thoughts to that, Ken?
We haven't really looked into it. We've looked at the idea of the solar panel farms within interchanges. That may be something that we entertain in the future. But to Lynn's point about getting electricity to these fiber locations, one thing we do, which is a little tangential, is we really do try to gain access to co-location facilities so that at least at some regular interval, 20, 50 miles or whatever, we have the opportunity to get our switches in the appropriate environment, and we usually write it so that power is provided for the duration of the agreement. So at least at the network level, we have found that really helps us out a lot in getting into those co-location spaces.
John, has that come up in any of your conversations as you try to build out your network statewide?
No, not so much. I found it interesting as the conversation just occurred that our situation is similar, give or take, to Dean's, and I guess that makes sense that we're both East Coast states, and so we share in a lot of the same history, perhaps.
Correct. Rob, has there been much work on the private side for that? Have you seen much of that? Co-locating electric grid infrastructure alongside?
No, not as much. They're pretty much going point to point to their connection offices with their data centers. Even when they distribute out to the user communities and the business parks, they will have one or two facilities. But from what Lynn and John and Ken's perspective, they're targeted with it. They have to put an ITS device every half mile or a mile. Then you have the electrical services for Ethernet switches, et cetera. The cost of copper is 5 to 7 times more than the cost of fiber to put into the road. When you consider the step up and step down transformers, all the infrastructure, the switches, the power meters, et cetera, all that infrastructure is more expensive than fiber.
Okay. So Anna, let me ask you a little bit different question. What do you think is the future of fiber optic resource sharing? Where are we headed in the next 5, 10, or 15 years?
I'll definitely be interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say on this as well. One thing, it's always difficult to predict the future. We're seeing, though, more states begin to sort of formalize these processes, put people in place who are specifically focused on that element and I think, Lynn touched on some of the work that UDOT is doing that helps get fiber into unserved areas, which can facilitate those last mile connections. And I think, we are seeing and will probably continue to see some more interesting projects along those lines. For example, Project Thor, which is a regional middle mile network in northwest Colorado that makes use of CDOT's fiber resources and receive funding through one of their state grant programs aimed at expanding broadband access in unserved and underserved areas that can, facilitate multiple goals and make efficient use of fiber resources.
Okay, Lynn, what's your crystal ball look like?
It's going to get bigger and bigger because right-of-way resources are limited. I believe Ron kind of really hit it on the head that you have to show your value if you're going to do public-private partnerships out to your partners because of the routes that are currently in. The difference that we found is we wanted to connect the schools, we wanted to connect the libraries, we wanted to add in redundancy to our towns and our communities. And the way to do that was with the roads and then to be able to make it reasonable for our telecommunication companies to be able to construct and partner with us and to be able to keep those communication lines. We started out with 2 or 3 partners 20 years ago, and we're up to almost 30 today, just within the telecom industry. And it doesn't look like it's going to stop, especially right now with all the COVID funding and everything that's coming in. I think the public-private partnering is going to grow and grow. And in order for us to be able to facilitate financially from a DOT side, we really need to take advantage of creating those partnerships and making them work so that both parties can equally benefit financially to be able to get these systems installed.
Excellent. Ken, what's your perspective, knowing that you've been at this for a long time, like Lynn in Virginia? So what do you see coming up the next 5 or 10 years?
I think the need is still going to be there. I think there's going to be a continual appetite for greater and greater bandwidth. I think what the DOTs can do is be a little more savvy or proactive about understanding or predicting where those opportunities are going to be. Where are the data centers coming up? What is the industry doing in general? You really have to invest some time in understanding those trends. And then likewise, understanding what your state's needs are. Are you working with the governor's office to serve underserved areas? And if so, you kind of have to push all of these together and make all the needs kind of line up. So, I think the opportunity is going to be there. I think it's on the states to really be proactive and search out those opportunities.
Okay. John, what's your perspective?
I think I'm generally in agreement with everybody. The need is going to only increase. I think that the reason for the need stands to shift. If 10 years ago, why are they building fiber? You would get an answer. Now, why would there be a continued demand for more fiber? The answer is shifted. 5 to 10 years, it's going to shift again, but the need will continue. Sometimes it is a kind of a redundancy thing. They want another path. But as we continue to put more communications in vehicles, the roadside matters. As we continue to address rural broadband, well then, reaching out on those roads matter, and there is a backhaul need commensurate with that. Increased, what is that called? GEM needs, government educational medical needs. We all know that. That's how so many of us function, right? So the needs they're not going to go away. They only stand to increase. I very much agree with Ken's contention, and Lynn witnesses it constantly. The need for government agencies, that's all us, right, to get pretty savvy. We need to learn this well. And this is a different world than our typical bread and butter that we've done for so many years.
Okay, Rob, let me let you close this panel session out. What's your thoughts on sort of where the future's headed?
Well, if everybody on this call can go back, yes, if everybody on this call can go back 20 years, I worked at level 3. We did build an undersea cable from London to New York, and at that time, we were terminating a terabit of bandwidth spread over 250 different routers. Today, the cables that are coming into Ken's locations in Virginia that are owned by Google and Facebook and other consortiums, they're terminating 40 to 100 terabytes. With that 1 terabyte cable that we installed supported 7 million AOL modems and also other communications with financial institutions, et cetera. But those speeds, the dial-up modem to today, most people have 10 megabit, 100 megabit, 50 megabit in your house. It's only going to go up. Moore's Law will continue. They already have terabit and 40 terabit and 100 terabit running in the labs. So the big data, and what's driving this is the Facebooks and the Snapchats, the Amazon, and the video services, financial services. Those markets are driving this. The bandwidth requirements from DOT, although substantial, they're doing 100 to 200 terabytes a day between New York and Chicago for trading. So the bandwidth is only going to go up, and it's going to filter down into our realm, in the DOT realm. So look for faster speeds, more functionality, and it's always the software and hardware functionality catching up with each other. It's going to be exciting from that perspective looking forward. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rob. Well, this concludes the sort of panel conversation. We have a few more questions, but this is now your opportunity to continue to ask questions. We've been trying to do that as we've gone along the webinar. Again, we will take a look. Let me start with MD had a question, and I'll try to, I don't know if I have anyone in particular to try to answer, but there was a question about, again, the bandwidth requirements of AV vehicles are really much higher than most of our traditional bandwidth needs today, even for video. Does anybody take that cost-efficient strategy? Did you take any cost-efficient strategy for that when we think about automated vehicles, if somebody wants to try to tackle that?
That's why we're putting in fiber to every single one of them on our own network. Would have been that cost on that transmission for that data. We wanted to be able to control that data and not to have a giant cost associated with it.
Okay. Anybody else? I thought Lynn posed an interesting question. So, what's your sort of typical fiber install size? Ken, you want to sort of elaborate a little bit on Virginia for your backbone?
Yeah, so, when we as an agency install fiber, which is less and less these days, quite honestly, I guess some time ago, our standard was kind of 96 counts for the backbone, and that might be 2 or 3 of those. And then any assortment of 12 to 24 count for distribution. But when we have resource sharing providers come in, if we do a drop off at pickup devices, we'll usually do a 12 count cable to get over to that device. As far as what some of the providers are putting in, I mean, it's mind-boggling. You know, well over hundreds of count. You know, they're using the ribbon style cables that are, you know, in some cases getting over 1,000 count. So it kind of touches on something Lynn mentioned earlier about access and how to achieve that access. And I think one of our biggest lessons learned is how to deal with access, especially when somebody is coming along with a long haul cable that's that complicated, that dense. You know, how do you say, hey, I just want to pick up this one little device right here, and I realize you got this, you know, enormously complex and dense fiber optic cable. And so that's probably the biggest area through the language in our agreements that we've had to work out over the years, is how to accommodate those different access points.
And we.
Okay. Anyone else want to try to answer any of your parts of that? Go ahead, Lynn.
That's where it comes really important for the DOTs when you're looking at your Facebooks, and we've got Facebook going all the way across our state, all over. We've got a new data center that just went in, and they want to connect. And we steered them away from actually them owning the fiber to going with one of our partners because of being classified as a utility within our right-of-ways. So that's something that you need to think about when you're thinking of sharing on that. And conduit seems to be my most important asset, not necessarily the fiber. Fiber is actually cheap to install within conduit, really quite cheap. It's getting that conduit into the ground and into the right-of-way and being able to be accessible that really gives you the most bang for your buck with all the telecoms that you're wanting to do partnering, and then being able to give you trade. So when you have a lot of conduit in your urban areas that you can then trade for your rural connections, it's huge. That's how we've got across the state, was leveraging our urban for those rural connections and getting those rural telecoms the ability to come into our urban areas as providers, as CLECs and secondary carriers, so they can open up their business so their business is stronger. So rural telecoms need that diversity that the urban areas can offer with that. And it's really helped the state out economically for our economic development and everything that's there.
Thank you, Lynn. There's another question that came in. Rob, I'll just direct this to you. Can resource sharing affect security of a network?
This is probably a better question for Ken and Linda. They know their networks, but typically a carrier and a DOT agency won't share the same strand of fiber or terminate it into a router. In some cases you can, but for the most part, the networks are separated and autonomous from each other. Ken or Lynn, could you elaborate on your networks?
We separate by the fiber optics. We do some carryover on circuits, but we keep those circuits within the state. We don't have them transmit on their internet section. So we have some really good tunneling. We have a company that's a quasi-governmental, Utopia, that connects a lot of the cities, and our networks mesh really well together. And the security really hasn't been an issue because we just pretty much VPN or point-to-point tunnel right through each other's networks. And we have meet points all across the state. This is really important. And I think Rob touched on this. Having places to meet and to be able to partner and to be able to switch between your networks and what is being carried. We have them at locations everywhere across the state. When we started, it was one location. Now we must have about 50 meet points across our state that we can all meet with telecoms. So that's like huge. Not much of a security issue at all. AWS is a bigger security issue on connected vehicle for us right now than anything with the carriers.
Yeah, and I would just add that.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry,
Ken.
yeah, I'd just say real quick for Virginia, we keep everything at the strand level. We do all the lit services, so we do feel it's a very secure arrangement.
So another interesting question that, John, I'll let you sort of maybe start this since I think you alluded to it in your discussion, but this sort of planning connection between states to connect, that infrastructure. I think as we grew up and, as I grew up in the ITS industry, you held everything very close and very tight. Now with more of this sharing, is there, in your conversations, have you all been discussing about, sharing with your neighboring states?
Yes.
Honestly, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, John. Why don't you go, then Lynn, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Honestly, it has not been a massive part of discussion because so much of that is so much of the need or the use of the conduit, and I think I agree with Lynn. I think the conduit is frankly the most valuable bit of the infrastructure. It is driven more, we think, by the needs of the developer, in our case, the company that would want to do that. Do they want to carry it across the state line? They may well. But that is, frankly, more their matter to deal with, not so much ours.
We want to definitely connect with our neighboring states on the DOTs. We've worked with Colorado over a few years. We're hitting that point where we're almost ready. They still have a little bit of build coming in from Denver. Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, we are sitting at all of those borders. Interstates go across state borders, and it would be great to look at future corridor management. It's kind of like what Colorado used to say, St. Louis to Salt Lake. Wouldn't that be great to have a managed corridor all the way through that the states could team up? And I think the fiber optics give you that connectivity. I can't wait till we connect from Salt Lake to Denver on private dark fiber between the two DOTs. And then figure out what we're going to be able to do with traffic management with that type of connectivity. I think we're just barely hitting the tip of the iceberg there, but it's something I think we definitely want to do.
I know there's lots of locations around the country where you cross jurisdictional lines very quickly from state to state. In the National Capital Region between Virginia, Maryland, D.C., we certainly have that. So there's lots of these locations around the country where I think it will become important. So very, very interesting question. Let me jump to a question that Daniela posed, and I'm going to go through the DOT folks first. And it was a question I was going to ask anyway. How do you sort of determine the value of the trade or exchange? So as you go through that negotiation, what are some of those lessons learned as you begin to negotiate and trade? So Lynn, you want to sort of touch on your experience?
We started with foot for foot. So if I have a foot of conduit in Salt Lake and I want a foot of conduit on your system, we started just valuating foot to foot, but then we found out that there was more to trade. Our state code just guides us to say that both parties have to agree on the trade value. So we started to get creative with the trades. Well, if you give me a circuit, how many feet of conduit does that entail within Salt Lake or within our urban area, if this is rural conduit versus urban? And we put together those trades and we both agree upon the cost. Maybe that's through construction, maybe one of our procurement contracts or anything like that. So each trade can be a little different, and we can put a different value on it depending on what we're getting and what our public-private partner is getting.
Okay, Ken?
Yeah, so, over the last couple of years, what we've settled on is kind of looking at the square foot value based on prevailing land values near the requested swath. And so we come up with a square foot value on a county by county basis. And we typically assume a swath of 5 foot disturbed land, sometimes up to 10 feet if it's a major build. And so then you end up with kind of a total value for all of the limited access right-of-way that's being requested. I think the bigger trick that we've been faced with is, okay, you get that value for the requested land, but then if we go and request conduit and fiber especially, how do you determine the value of that? And there's so many different ways to look at that. the provider will turn around and say, well, you're going to split the cost with me. But then we'll turn around and say, no, actually it's just the material incremental cost of those 12 fibers I'm asking for, which is pennies on the dollar. So, you know, that's where there's going to be a lot of variance in how you determine what the fair cost should be for those other goods that you're receiving in return. So that's probably where the biggest work has occurred recently when we've tried to assess a value on those goods and services that we get in return.
I gave you a link.
Andy, go ahead, Lynn.
I provided a link on my slides at the end where it says links, where I give you our valuation for our controlled access, how we did it. It's our valuation report. So if you click on that link, you can see our UDOT valuation on controlled access. We do that per foot on our interstates as well. We don't do it on our non-interstates, but we do that on the interstates. And there's a report there that shows you how we do it.
Okay, thank you. Ken, just a quick follow-up. Have you had experience as you've changed sort of how you negotiate stuff showing up in your state legislature or state general assembly as far as bills or changes?
We haven't as of this point. I mean, it does kind of lead to a broader discussion about how aggressively to partner with our providers that are looking to enter into a relationship with us. So, you know, openness and fairness is kind of at the heart of, you know, whenever we're entering into these discussions. But at least on the fiber side, there really hasn't been much proposed at the General Assembly level. On the wireless side, it's totally different. There's been pretty significant changes on that front.
Okay. John or Rob, anything you guys want to add?
John, do you have anything?
No, not really. Not really. I think I'm good there.
Okay. I can say this to this one piece. If you're looking to find out what's the procedure, what your carrier that you're talking to or your communication provider you're talking to, if you want a quick and dirty means to figure out your regulations, in Florida, there's I-95 that goes up the East Coast. That's the interstate. Before that, there was US 1 or A1A that went up the East Coast. FHW interstate road versus a state road. If you took 20, 50, or 100 miles of that and figured out what it would cost you to build on the interstate and the rules and regulations with your permits and your state regulations, then figure out what it costs to do the state road with the permits and regulations. From a carrier perspective, which one's going to be the most cost-effective to them is what they're going to go with. Well, my point is the Communications Act allowed us to go on state roads with minimal permitting fees. If you go on interstate roads, and every state has a different permit regulation, that might facilitate your decision.
Okay, excellent. All right, panelists, do you have any last comments before we close? All right, we will go ahead and try to answer the questions as best we can. I would like to thank each of the panelists, Anna, Lynn, Ken, John, and Rob, for their time. I think this was a really good discussion. You all had a lot of great questions from the audience. We appreciate, we had, I think, up to 94 folks participate. I think one of the great ideas that I have out of this is that we should have a NOCO competition for the best looking fiber optic resource deployment, sharing, or installation. And I think Utah's probably going to be in the lead based on what Lynn shared. So maybe we can do that. I do think we want to continue to share best practices and use the National Operations Center of Excellence as a mechanism. And for those of you that are part of AASHTO CTSO, we want to continue that discussion. There are several subcommittees under CTSO that pick up the communications and the ITS group that pick these up. So please continue that participation dialogue, and it's really the only way we can get better as a country is we keep sharing what everybody's doing together. That's the best way for us to get through this. So with that, it's 3 o'clock Eastern. We'll go ahead and close the webinar. Thank you everybody very much, and have a great and safe day. Thank you.